Hello everybody, and welcome to a draft level up video. Today I am going to be talking about how to evaluate archetypes. But before I dive in, I do want to remind you that if you enjoy this video and draft level up content, be sure to hit that thumbs up button, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment in the comment section down below with your questions and feedback. Also, if you would like to support the channel directly, you can do so via the Patreon, patreon.com/NicolaiBolas. Without further ado, let's dive on in. In this guide, we are going to be talking about how to evaluate an archetype in several different lenses. First of all, through the cards that are going to be in that archetype. Next, through the strategy of that archetype. Third, through the support for that archetype. Fourth, through the competition for that archetype. And then finally, we're going to be talking about some traps to avoid when evaluating archetypes. So, starting things off with the cards. What are you looking for in cards for your archetype? First, you're looking for generic power. These are cards that are just going to be good and that they fit into the archetype, either because they're gold cards for that color combination or just because they're single colored cards that are going to go into your deck. Number two, you want to look whether you have strong or weak colors. If your archetype has stronger colors, then you're going to be rewarded for drafting that color just by having more power level in the cards themselves, and weaker colors are going to need a little bit more of a synergy boost from the archetype in order to be as viable. Number three, complementing colors. Some colors play a little bit better together than others, and this is reflected in a little bit of a boost for those archetypes. And then fourth, bonus synergy for the archetype. This is reflected in the fact that some cards are going to be more playable in your archetype than in others. You're going to be getting cards late that you really want for your deck that other people are not interested in, so this is some bonus synergy for the archetype. Okie doke, kicking things off with generic power, we're going to be looking at an example from Dominaria. If we look at Tiana, Ship's Caretaker, and Tatyova, Benthic Druid, they are both 5 converted mana cost cards for different archetypes, red-white and blue-green respectively. However, if you look at, and they're both 3/3s in fact, however, if you look at the power level of the card, Tatyova is the sort of card that can take over a game by itself, whereas Tiana was unsupported in that format and its text rarely came up. So, looking at these sorts of cards, if you are starting off a draft and you open up a pack that contains both Tatyova and Tiana, you're going to be taking the Tatyova and drafting blue-green, which is a little boost in power for those blue-green decks because you're more likely to want to put a powerful uncommon into your deck. So just having more power level makes the archetype better, which is probably quite obvious. These cards aren't particularly synergistic. It wasn't that blue-green was a landfall deck. It was more so that Tatyova was just a good card that you're going to want to be putting in your deck. And the same applies for individually powerful blue and green cards. If the blue and green cards are more powerful than the red and white cards, then the blue and green decks will be getting a boost. Moving on to another example, but this one of strong colors. In Theros Beyond Death, black was the best color, which made every black archetype more desirable. So you want to be putting the good cards in your deck, and so you're more likely to be drafting the black cards, and that means that the black archetypes are more desirable just because they contain the color black. On the flip side, black was the worst color in Core Set 2021, which made every black archetype less desirable. This was because of a combination of factors, partly because the threats were so cheap that cards like Finishing Blow didn't line up particularly well, but generally, black was not a great color, so you're not going to be wanting to play the archetypes that contain black. So those archetypes get a little bit of a downgrade. Moving on to our fourth little criteria here for evaluating the cards, we're going to look at complementing colors. Actually, this is the fourth. If we're looking at red-white, it's often an aggro-color combination, so the cards are going to have natural overlap that way in many cases, which means that red-white doesn't necessarily need as much of a clear goal. It doesn't have to be the red-white Mentor deck or the red-white whatever deck. It just has to be the red-white aggro deck, which is a much larger basket that you can put your archetype into and means that you don't have to rely on as much specific stuff. So oftentimes a red-white aggro deck is going to be a good deck in the format because the colors just have good synergy with each other. Similarly, blue-black is often going to be a control deck because on the opposite end of the spectrum, blue provides card draw, black provides removal, and together you have the tools for a control deck. Looking at some bonus synergy, we're going to be looking at blue-red spells from Core Set 2021, because in Core Set 2021, blue-red cared about instants and sorceries, which helped some cards overperform. So Experimental Overload is a complete blank in your deck if you don't have instants and sorceries, so you're going to want to put a little bit more priority on those. Cards like Goblin Wizardry also reward you for casting instants and sorceries, non-creatures in general, but mostly instants and sorceries in this format. And so a card like Goblin Wizardry could be the best card or one of the best cards or a key player in your blue-red deck, but is a card that other decks don't want. And similarly, a card like Opt could really be a key facilitator for your deck, whereas other decks wouldn't really be interested. Moving on to the strategy component of a deck, we're going to be looking at evaluating strategies in terms of their simplicity, their proactivity, because being proactive and making your opponent answer your threats can be a nice advantage. The interaction difficulty, this is something that you can consider when you're looking at a strategy. How hard is it for your opponent to stop what you're doing? So a classic example of this would be a mill deck, because if you're playing mill, your opponent's not typically going to be playing cards that stop you from milling them, so it's really hard to interact with your strategy if you build it well. And then fourth, is it something you would be doing anyway? So this is the sort of thing where there are some strategies where they just require you to put good cards into your deck that you already would have put into your deck, and then they give you a little bit of a further boost for playing those. So if you look back to something like Guilds of Ravnica with Surveil is already just a good mechanic because it's basically just a powered up version of Scry, and since you're already going to be putting those cards into your deck, having a little bit of an extra incentive to play those cards from cards like Disinformation Campaign that reward you for surveilling is quite nice. So if it's something you're going to be doing anyway, the strategy can get a nice little boost. Whereas on the flip side, if you're in a strange format where red-white has a mechanic that rewards you for blocking, it might not be something that your red-white deck is prepared to do. You might want to be attacking with your red-white cards. So if a strategy wants you to be blocking, it's going to get a little bit of a negative grade. It's going to go down a little bit. So a great example of strategy in action is red-white cycling in Ikoria. It is a pretty simple archetype. You put cyclers into your deck, and then you cycle those and use those to power up your cycling payoffs, like your Zenith Flare. It is a proactive deck. It had a lot of cheap creatures. It had some creatures that got bigger when you cycled, so you could attack your opponent pretty effectively and put them under pressure before they could establish their own engines. 3, interaction difficulty. If you had a Zenith Flare in your deck, it was really hard to interact with. If you had a Prickly Marmoset, it could be really hard to interact with because you would just be hitting them with a 3-mana 2/3 that just continued to grow with First Strike. Sorry, I don't have all of the card images, but essentially it was a very difficult to block creature for those of you that did not play in Ikoria. Zenith Flare was, as I have shown here on the screen, if you had a bunch of cyclers in your deck, you could sometimes hit them for like 7 damage or even more damage sometimes, and that just ended the game and was really difficult to interact with. And then finally, is it something you would do anyway? This is where red-white cycling is a little bit different, because in a typical format, you wouldn't be playing cyclers the way you would in Ikoria. In Ikoria, you would be playing 1-mana cyclers that weren't even the color of your deck. So that's not necessarily something you would be doing anyway, but within the context of the format, you already want to be playing a lot of the cards because they're just on-color 2-drops that have some cycling little payoffs and things like that. So it is generally something you want to be doing anyway, is being aggressive with your red-white deck. Moving on to another example from a more recent set, white-black clerics in Zendikar Rising. It's simplicity. It is a very simple deck. You put clerics in your deck, and there's some cards that care about clerics. There are some cards that care about life gain, and then there are some cards that give you life. It's a pretty simple strategy. It's nothing too complex. Next, proactivity. It's not the most proactive deck. It can certainly grind into the mid or late game, but it can have some aggressive starts. But it's not like a deck that's going to be putting your opponent and forcing them to answer all of your cards, though there are some snowbally starts, like if you start with a Cleric of Life spawned, for instance. Number 3, interaction difficulty. This isn't really a feature of white-black clerics. It's pretty easy to interact with. It's a pretty slow deck. It relies on creatures generally, so it's not going to be that difficult to interact with unless you're using something like a Relic Vial, which is an artifact, and therefore makes it a little bit harder to interact with. 4th, is it something you would do anyway? Pretty much. White-black already has a lot of cleric creatures in it, so you're going to be getting a lot of these synergies just by building a black-white deck in Zendikar Rising. You don't really have to do anything special. Moving on to support. This is another key aspect of having a good archetype. You need to look at the number and quality of payoffs, the number and quality of enablers, and format alignment. What do I mean by format alignment? Format alignment is when an archetype might not look as good on the surface, but it is something that is good to... I clicked the spacebar by accident. It's something that's good to do in the format. So, for example, some formats are faster than others, so archetypes that are aggression-based are going to align with the format better. If you think back to something like Amonkhet, where Exert was one of the mechanics in that set, the decks that relied on exerting their creatures and attacking and getting in damage like that were a little bit better supported than archetypes that relied on like playing control games and using Embalm to get value and things like that. You would rather be on the front foot than the back foot. There are formats where you'd rather be a slower deck, where the aggression is not really rewarded. Things like Dominaria, where red-white aggro was just not as well supported, and so even if the archetype looks relatively strong, the other archetypes are just a little bit better. So you need to know a little bit about how your archetype is going to line up with the format at large. If there's a lot of 1/3s in the format and your deck is built around doing 1 damage to other creatures, it's not going to be as effective, things of that nature. But let's take an example. Black-Red Sacrifice in Ikoria. It was a very well-supported archetype. It used cards like Bastion of Remembrance and weaponized the monsters to leverage small creatures and sacrifice them for value, essentially. Number of payoffs. There were a decent number of payoffs. Weaponize the Monsters and Bastion of Remembrance were two of the biggest payoffs for having small creatures and then being able to sacrifice them. So cards of that nature were actually, there were a decent number of cards that let you sacrifice or rewarded you for sacrificing. Enablers, when it comes to sacrifice, to enable that, you oftentimes want a steal effect, which was in the format in the form of, I believe, Tentative Connection. It was 3 and a red for a steal your opponent's creature, and it would cost 3 less if you had a menace creature. So there was an enabler for that, sort of steal your opponent's creature and sacrifice it. And then there were cards like Whisper Squad, which you could play and then use it to get more Whisper Squads and then sacrifice those for value. And I guess in terms of payoffs, you would choose cards that sacrifice things for value, like Bushmeat Poacher from Ikoria was another payoff for having small creatures in play. And then format alignment. This actually lined up pretty well with the format. It was a way to nickel and dime your opponents out, get slow value, and be pretty interactive in the process, which was pretty good against the other aggressive decks, and even against the controlling decks. You had the tools to grind into the late game a lot of the time. Okie doke. Looking at competition. Competition isn't saying whether a deck is competitive, it is saying how much competition is there going to be for the deck, which is actually quite relevant, especially as a format goes on, because sometimes there will be decks that have virtually no competition because people don't understand how to draft them or they are unwilling to draft them, and sometimes there will be decks that have high amounts of competition because everyone knows that the deck is good and they are just drafting it like a storm. So in the beginning of Ikoria, red-white cycling had virtually no competition, so you could just draft it very often and do quite well with it. But as the format went on and people learned more about how to prioritize cyclers, the competition got more fierce and the deck went down in power level accordingly. So what you're going to look for in competition is card overlap. This is if an opponent's deck, if other players' decks are going to want the same cards as yours, then your deck is going to be getting worse because there's card overlap. If there's no card overlap, if I want cards that nobody else wants, my deck is going to be much better because I'm going to be getting the cards I want later in the draft. Deck awareness. If people don't know that the deck exists, then that means there's going to be lower competition for it. So when cycling was unknown, there was less competition. When it was more known, there was more competition. So deck awareness can play a key factor. Number 3, ease of entrance. How easy is it to draft the deck? Do I have to start with a gold uncommon for the deck? Is it that important for the deck? Or can I just start with a good green card, a good black card, and draft black-green, or something of that nature? Sometimes it's easier or harder to get into a deck because you might rely on key cards or a key signal point. Like maybe you'll only get into a deck that if you wheel a specific card because you need to be the only player in your pod drafting it in order to go for that deck. And then 4th, ease of execution. Sometimes a deck is simply harder to play than another deck, which might scare newer players away from trying it, or it just might be a complicated deck on the mana base where it involves building a complex mana base, which might make the deck less appealing to other players. So make sure the decks that have harder execution are going to be less fought over. Let's look at an example from Amonkhet, Slitherblade Aggro. This was a deck that some people were aware of, some people were not. It actually did quite well at the Pro Tour in that format because one testing team had come up with this deck and they knew that it was not going to be competed over. So what did you have? Card overlap. The deck relied on Slitherblade, which is a card nobody else wanted. You could regularly wheel that card. And it also relied on cheap ways to buff the card, which you could often get quite easily. Deck awareness. Very few people knew about the deck going into the Pro Tour. This one testing team was pretty sure that very few others knew about it, and so they could draft the deck and thrive with the deck where other people would not care about any of the cards that they needed. Ease of entrance. It was pretty easy to get into the deck because nobody knew about it, and so you could regularly wheel the cards you needed, take all the cards that you wanted for the deck, and nobody else would be interested in those. And ease of execution. It was, I would say, relatively difficult to figure out how the deck worked at the beginning when you were just figuring it out, but it wasn't that hard to execute on once you actually had the deck. So it wasn't a deck that was not competed over because it was hard to execute on. It was a deck that wasn't competed over because people were simply not aware of the deck's existence. And once people started to figure that out, and you stopped being able to wheel Slitherblades, which would happen if there was a second Pro Tour and people knew about the deck, then the deck would cease to be as effective because as soon as somebody starts hate drafting a Slitherblade, your deck just starts to crumble. Another example could be 5-color Snow in Kaldheim. The full set has not yet been spoiled, but this is the sort of deck that would fit this criteria quite well. Path to the World Tree has a 5-color activation on it that's actually pretty good, or at least very interesting. And if this is the sort of thing that is viable in Kaldheim, it would fit. It would be pretty good on a competitive standpoint. So card overlap. A lot of the time, you're going to want to be prioritizing mana fixing and maybe cards that other more proactive decks aren't interested in. So a 5-color deck could potentially be good for that reason. Deck awareness. It's likely that if this sort of deck did exist, it would start off pretty niche and people wouldn't be aware of it, so you could maybe get the cards you needed for it, maybe wheel your Path to the World trees, because if you're not trying to play a 5-color deck, Path to the World tree is not a particularly good card. Ease of entrance, it's probably pretty difficult to get into this sort of deck. It's not only going to be tricky to draft, but also tricky to know what payoffs are worth doing it for. So potentially not a deck that's very easy to get into. You might actually need to open Path to the World tree or some other card that pays you off for going 5-color before you want to get into it. So that's another example of ease of entrance, is if it's hard to get into the deck because you need to open a specific card. And then finally, ease of execution, likely very high, which is why the deck would probably be underdrafted, because it is very hard to play a deck like this. It's very hard to draft a deck like this. It's very hard to make the mana work in a deck like this. And so if there's a 5-color snow deck in Kaldheim, or a 5-color deck in general, the execution is high, and that's probably going to make the competition for that deck low. So let's look at some traps that you need to avoid when evaluating an archetype. One, you need to be vigilant for weak payoffs. Sometimes the payoffs just aren't good, so just because it has the relevant keyword on it doesn't mean it's a good payoff. Two, lack of support. Oftentimes you might see a good payoff and then realize afterwards that there's no cards to facilitate it at common, which is an important element for your deck. Three, bad fits for the format. These are the sorts of decks that are controlling when the format is very aggressive and it's going to be beating them down. So sometimes the cards all look like they're there and the pieces look like they're there, but it's missing 1/2 drop, and so it's a bad fit for the format because it just gets run over before it does its thing, or it's doing something that the format simply doesn't care about. If there's a mill deck in a format that has cards to shuffle your graveyard back in, or things of that nature, or a mill deck in a format where your opponent has a lot of ways to use the graveyard, could be an example of that, because if you're trying to mill your opponent out and they're just getting a ton of card advantage while you're doing that, that could be a bad fit for the format. And then finally, the signpost uncommon leading you astray is another thing to be vigilant for. Sometimes the uncommon is not actually particularly good or representative of what that strategy is about. So in those sorts of cases, you need to look at the uncommon, realize that it doesn't fit the deck, and then try to go approach the deck from a different angle. So for example, Black-Red Sacrifice in M21, this is a pretty typical example of a deck that wasn't really supported. Weak payoffs, it just didn't really have payoffs for sacrificing creatures. There weren't really a ton of ways to sacrifice them, and the ways that there weren't particularly good. Lack of support, it just didn't have sacrifice fodder. There weren't like things like dragon fodder that make 2 1/1s to sacrifice, and there wasn't a common way to steal your opponent's creatures. 3, bad format fit. It wouldn't necessarily have been a bad format fit. It just was not really a deck that existed in that format. Black-Red was more of just a grindy mid-range deck. And then finally, the signpost uncommon leads you astray. This was a pretty classic example of that, because Direfleet Warmonger looks like it's going to say Black-Red is a sacrifice deck. It's a sacrifice aggro deck, but the deck ended up playing out as more of a Black-Red mid-range deck that relied on a lot of the removal spells available to Black-Red, and so it led many people to think, oh, Black-Red's a bad archetype because there's not sacrifice stuff, rather than going to the 4th step, seeing that the signpost uncommon is leading them astray, and then going back and thinking, so what does Black-Red do well? And then finding a different answer to their problem. So Black-Red could be a good deck, but it wasn't a good Black-Red sacrifice deck, is why you need to be aware of these sorts of traps. Okie doke, so all together now, what are we looking to do? Use as many lenses as possible when evaluating an archetype. You don't want to just use one, you want to use as many as possible, hopefully all of them. So evaluate the card strength available to the archetype based on the criteria I mentioned before. Is the strategy powerful? Is the key thing to ask. How effectively is the archetype supported? And then finally, assess the competition levels and be vigilant for traps. So now we're going to be looking at some currently untested archetypes from Kaldheim and using those as a way to follow all of these steps. So, for example, we're going to be, and I will say before I start this section that not all of the cards from Kaldheim have been revealed as I am making this section of the guide. I think it just would be an interesting exercise in an archetype that hasn't been tested, because it's very hard not to let bias reflect back, for example, on something like Red-White in Ikoria, where you're like, wow, Red-White cycling was an incredibly busted deck. This is why, this is why, this is why. But it's also valuable to be able to say, this sort of deck is untested. I haven't actually played with it yet, but I still think this is the reason it's going to be good, or this is the reason it's not going to be good. So those are all both valuable methods of both figuring out why a deck was good and also figuring out if a deck will be good. So, for example, Black-White double spell in Kaldheim. Its signpost uncommon is Furia, Judge of Valor. It's 2 white, black, black for a 2/4 flying lifelink that says whenever you cast your second spell each turn, look at the top 3 cards of your library, put one of them into your hand and the rest into your graveyard. So it looks like it is a deck that rewards you for casting your second spell each turn, which immediately makes me think, okay, I'm going to be on the lookout for strong cards that are cheap so I can double spell. Okay, looking at the cards. Generic power. It's a little bit too early in the preview season to say whether there are like higher power level cards in white and black compared to the other colors. It's looking like both of them are going to be fairly reasonable for now. Number 2, strong or weak colors. Similarly, it's early in preview season, but these are the things you need to be keeping in mind when you are evaluating them. So if you're watching this guide, maybe after the formats come out, you can use these things then, or if you're evaluating, or if the preview season has advanced further than it has for me when you're watching this, then you'll be able to potentially know which colors are looking the strongest or the weakest, because these are things that are relevant to keep in mind. Number 3, complementing colors. Black, white generally is fairly complementary. Oftentimes they will have decent grindy tools. Sometimes white is all aggressive and black is all controlling, and then they don't really play well together. But a lot of the times they are going to be a pretty good grindy combination that just uses good creatures and value. So the colors do complement fairly well. And then finally, bonus synergy. In this sort of deck, cards that you're going to want that go up in value are going to be cheap cards that cost like 1 mana, other cards that reward you for casting your second spell that maybe others aren't interested in, and yeah, just those sorts of cards are the things that might go up in power level. So looking at the preview cards that have been previewed, there seem to be quite a few cards like that. So black-white might be an archetype that is decently supported from that perspective. Looking at the strategy of the deck, we can see that it is fairly simple. Casting 2 spells in a turn is not that hard to do. Proactivity, it just doesn't seem like it does actually seem like a relatively proactive strategy, because a lot of the cards in the set put counters on your creatures when you cast your second spell in a turn, and the strategy rewards you for playing cheap cards. So if you want to, number 1, be playing a lot of cheap cards, and number 2, putting like the reward for the strategy is making your creatures bigger, then the deck is going to tend to be a little bit more proactive. However, as you can see with Furia, Judge of Valor, it's not a particularly large body for its cost, so the deck looks like it can have some grindy and proactive elements. Number 3, interaction difficulty. It's relatively easy to interact with this strategy if you're using a card that is a creature as your trigger, because your opponent can just kill the creature that has the cast your second spell trigger on it. But with regards to interacting with the cast your second spell, it's not like they can stop you from casting a second spell in a turn, other than like even if they counter it, you'll still get the trigger for casting the spell. It doesn't say that the spell has to resolve. It's just a cast trigger. 4, is it something you would do anyway? Trying to multi-spell is something that you're always going to be looking to do in limited, but maybe you're going to push it a little bit to the extreme in this particular instance. Okay, looking at support for the archetype, number of payoffs. I've already looked at the spoiler. There's not all that many cards spoiled yet compared to the full set. I guess a lot of them, there's a decent number spoiled, but there do seem to be a good number of payoffs for the set that seem powerful. Number of enablers. Basically, you're looking for cheap cards here, and there do seem to be some cheap cards that are going to reward you for this strategy, and going to help you draft a deck that cares about casting 2 spells in a turn more often than typical limited decks. And 3, format alignment. It's really hard to say before the format has actually come out how it's going to line up with the format. Finally, competition. Card overlap. Well, I'm assuming that there's going to be card overlap for the good removal spells, things like that, but there might not be as much card overlap for the cards that care about casting 2 spells in a turn, because those might require some deck building restrictions in order to make them maximized, though some of them are like just decently powerful on their own. So there is going to be some card overlap here. Deck awareness. People are going to be aware of this deck because there are signpost uncommons that literally tell you what the deck does. This isn't some sort of secret deck. It would be really hard for me to be aware of the secret decks in the format. Maybe that 5-color deck I talked about earlier would be a deck awareness that was low, but this is going to be pretty high deck awareness. Ease of entrance. I'm assuming that if you like pick up a Furia, you can enter the deck. I'm also assuming that if you start with a white card, start with the next pick up black card, that you can just enter the deck naturally. It doesn't look like it's weak enough that you wouldn't want to enter it, or that it's too reliant on any particular common or uncommon that you wouldn't want to enter it. And then finally, ease of execution. Pretty straightforward deck to execute on. You just want to put cheap cards into your deck. And finally, traps, weak payoffs. The payoffs have all seemed pretty fine to me. Lack of support seems relatively well supported. It's not like a deck that requires that much support. It's not like a card draw archetype where there's no card draw in the set. It just seems relatively well supported. And the foretell mechanic in particular seems like it will support the mechanic quite well, because it lets you cast spells for cheaper on future turns so that you can double spell with them. Bad format fit, really hard to say. And then the signpost uncommon leads you astray. I don't think it does in this case, unless white-black wants to be a super aggro deck, and then this card's like not really aggressive, but that seems unlikely because this card does seem quite powerful. Okie doke, moving on to another example, blue-white foretell in Kaldheim. The signpost uncommon doesn't literally say foretell, but it says whenever you cast a spell from anywhere other than your hand, draw a card, and foretell is a mechanic that lets you put cards from your hand into exile and then cast them from there later. So Vega is basically a reward for that, and it is quite a powerful reward for doing that, because drawing an extra card whenever you cast a spell is quite good, because it's not like those cards are bad or anything of that nature. So looking at the cards, is there generic power? There is a lot of power in the foretell mechanic, so there's a lot of cards that are just quite good, because being able to have the option of casting them for potentially cheaper is quite nice. Strong or weak colors, too early to say on that front, though there do look to be a lot of strong cards in all the colors so far. I mean, there are just some really interesting designs in this set. Complementing colors. Blue-white does tend to be a pretty complementary color pair, either as a controlling archetype or as a flyers archetype. So if you are trying to be a more controlling deck, those colors do complement each other. Because again, blue provides the card draw, white can provide the removal, especially because there looks to be some nice defensive removal in that it targets attacking creatures, or I think it might be tapped creatures, but something of that nature. So the colors do complement pretty well. And then bonus synergy. You do get bonus synergy for foretell, but those cards are generally going to be good anyway, so you don't really get a ton of bonus synergy in this sort of deck. Strategy. Simplicity. It's a pretty simple strategy. You play foretell cards together. Foretell cards naturally have synergy with each other, because especially if they're instants, your opponent's not going to know which ones you have because they're exiled face down. So simplicity is a fairly simple strategy. Put foretell cards in your deck. Proactivity. It's not a very proactive deck. Foretell is a relatively slow mechanic, because you are putting the cards away for a turn and then casting them later for cheaper, but you're not actually getting the curve out potential, because if you're spending turn 2 putting a card into exile, you're not beating your opponent down. Interaction difficulty. It's pretty hard to interact with foretell. It's pretty hard to interact with Vega, because you'll have to just counter the spell when it comes down, and it's often going to come down for cheap. So if you hold up a counter spell for 3 mana and they cast their foretell spell for 1 mana, you get kind of wrecked by the mana exchange. Or if they just put another foretell card down when you are holding up a counterspell, you get wrecked. So pretty difficult to interact with foretell, though you can just kill the creatures that they do end up playing. Then finally, is it something you would do anyway? Certainly. There's a lot of foretell cards. A lot of them are powerful. You're going to want to do it anyway. Support for the archetype. Number of payoffs. I haven't seen how many cards reward you for playing cards from exile or for foretelling, but I'm assuming there's a decent number, or that there will be by the time the set is fully revealed. Number of enablers. There are tons of cards with foretell across multiple colors, so it looks like you could even maybe splash some cards with foretell, and that there are a good number of enablers for this sort of strategy. And then format alignment. We'll have to see if the format is fast or slow. The slower the format, the better a deck like this will be, I think. Though foretell can, because foretell is just not really an aggressive mechanic for attacking. And then finally, competition, card overlap. A lot of decks are going to want the foretell cards. You're not going to be getting the foretell cards just because they have foretell on them. So if this is a deck that relies on that, there's going to be a lot of overlap with other decks. Deck awareness. As I said for the previous example, people are going to know that this deck exists. Ease of entrance. I'm assuming if you just end up with a blue-white deck, you'll end up with some foretell synergy. It doesn't seem that hard. Ease of execution. Really a simple deck. Traps. Weak payoffs. Vega certainly isn't a weak payoff. Vega's certainly quite strong, so currently haven't seen any particularly weak payoffs. Lack of support. There's so many foretell cards. There's not a lack of support. Bad format fit. We'll have to see if the format's too fast to support foretell, though I doubt they would make a format like that, but it's happened before in the past. And then the signpost uncommon leads you astray. Maybe, but if judging by the number of blue and white cards I've seen with the foretell mechanic, I don't think that's going to be the case. Moving on to the next archetype, we have red-white auras and equipment in Kaldheim. So the legendary card, the signpost uncommon, is Cole the Forge Master. So it's red-white for a 2/2 that whenever another non-token creature you control dies, if it's enchanted or equipped, return it to its owner's hand. Creature tokens you control that are enchanted or equipped get +1/+1. So it does reward you for having enchantment like auras and equipments. So what does that tell you? Cards, generic power. The equipments that we've been seeing in recent sets are generally not that powerful. The red and white cards have been decently powerful from what I've seen, but I haven't seen any specific equipment that makes me go, wow, this equipment is great. The generic power would have to come from just red and white cards being good, rather than from an equipment that I haven't seen any really broken equipments or anything, or broken auras. Strong or weak colors. Too early to say, as I was talking about before. Complementing colors. Red, white typically complement each other very well. They are just great colors for an aggressive deck, so even if you don't end up building around auras and equipment, you'll probably be able to have a really sweet deck. And then finally, bonus synergy. There are a couple of auras and equipments that do look like they will be role players in the format, that are deck cards other decks aren't going to want, but that your red-white deck should be able to get access to. There's a short sword variant in red that's a little bit better than short sword if you are a red deck, and that could be a nice little key for this sort of deck. And there's there's going to be a couple of cards that are going to give you a little bump in this deck because a lot of other decks aren't interested in equipments or auras. Strategy. Simplicity. Red-white is a beatdown deck. Adding a little bit of an equipments and auras theme is not going to change that, so it's still a simple strategy. Proactivity. One of the most proactive decks out there, just going to be beating your opponent down. Interaction difficulty. It's sometimes difficult to interact with aggressive decks, but this is not really one of those cases. You just have to kill their creatures, and it's actually more prone to interaction because if you're suiting up your creature with an aura, you get into trouble when your opponent kills it or bounces it. Similar with an equipment, if you're paying an expensive equip cost and they kill that creature, you're in trouble. And then finally, is it something you would do anyway? Pretty much. If you're playing an aggressive deck, you're going to be putting a couple of equipments in your deck, so it's something you're going to be doing anyway, and if you get a little bit of an extra bonus for that, it's a really nice gravy on top of the mashed potatoes, as the saying goes. Support. Number of payoffs. So far, Coal is a payoff. There is an aura that lets you get back other auras, or maybe equipments. I don't have all the cards memorized because it's still early in preview season, but there are some payoffs. I haven't seen a ton of them, though, so maybe we'll see more as time goes on. Though, as I was saying, red-white can just function as an aggressive deck, so you don't really need to have payoffs for this bonus theme, that you can just treat that as gravy. Next is number of enablers. Haven't seen a ton of equipments or auras, but I'm pretty confident that there will be more revealed. And then finally, format alignment. We'll have to see how fast the format is, but if the format is fast, there's a good chance that this will be one of the better decks. And it's generally a bit hard to go wrong with red-white because it's such a proactive deck that can punish your opponent for stumbling pretty well. Competition. Card overlap. If there are equipments and auras in the format, a lot of other decks won't be interested, so that could be a nice little way to get an edge. You could see an equipment in an early pack and try to wheel it, or things of that nature, but the red and white aggressive creatures are probably going to have some overlap. Deck awareness. People are going to know this deck exists because the signpost uncommon that I'm relying on to tell me what the deck is also available to everybody to see. Ease of entrance. You can probably just get into a red-white aggro deck and pick up some equipments. It's not going to be that hard. And ease of execution. It's a red-white aggro deck. It's not the most complex deck to play, and you should be able to execute fairly easily on it. Finally, some traps. Weak payoffs. That could certainly be the case. I haven't seen a ton of the payoffs yet. I don't think they've been previewed, but that could be something that happens because you really do need quite good payoffs to incentivize you to put auras in your deck in particular, because it is a massive blowout if your opponent 2-for-1s you as soon as you put an aura on a creature. 2, lack of support. That could also be a problem. There might just not be good equipments and auras to put on your creatures. So if there's no payoffs and no support, then you just end up drafting a red-white aggro deck, and it's not like a special auras and equipment deck. Next, bad format fit. It could be a format where auras and equipment get blown out. It could be a bad format for aggro, so we'll have to wait and see. And finally, the signpost uncommon leads you astray. This is actually something that could easily happen with this sort of deck, as we saw with the Tiana Ship's Navigator card from very early on in this video that we saw that was in Dominaria. That sort of strategy was not supported in Dominaria, so there is a history of that kind of thing happening, which means that this Cole the Forge Master could just be a generic 2-mana 2/2 in your deck, which isn't what you'd want. Ideally, it would be a signpost uncommon, and because it is a very good card if equipments and auras are viable. But we'll just have to wait and see, and we'll have to reevaluate and make sure that we don't overestimate the power level of Cole or think, oh, red-white is an auras and equipment deck, when it could just be a powerful aggro deck in its own right. Okay, more preparation. I've gone through some basic steps you can use to evaluate whether an archetype is going to be good, but there is even more you can do to evaluate an archetype. Number 1, you can build a deck skeleton. This is where you look through all the cards in the set and you give yourself a limit, like, okay, I'm going to let myself have 2 uncommons from this color combination, and then the rest is going to be commons, and I'm going to limit the number of each common I can have, and then you build a deck skeleton from there, and you see, well, this is a deck built of all commons, and it's not going to be that hard to get these commons, and it looks quite powerful. So building a deck skeleton beforehand, or thinking about how a deck skeleton would look, is quite good. Looking for sleeper cards is another way that you can gain an advantage. Sleeper cards would be something like, oh, I think this card is good, but I think that it also looks like it would be bad, so other people might not value this card, and so I can get into this deck that uses the card more often, or something of that nature. Oftentimes, there will be cards that the public underestimates that you get an edge on, or cards that you overestimate and the public is more correct on. So make sure that you are if you're trying to go like, oh, this is a sleeper card, make sure that you do reevaluate after a little bit. 3, you can decide on the best home for each card. If you go through the set and you look at each card and you think, which archetype is this best in? And then you find an archetype that just has a ton of cards that are good in it. That can be another way to evaluate which archetypes are the best. You can also just do that after the set has been out for a little bit. When you're trying to like rank archetypes, you can think, well, this blue card is good in every single blue archetype. This blue card is only good in this archetype. This blue card is good in this archetype. And so if you find that all of the blue cards are good in archetypes A and B, then maybe archetypes C, D, and E are a little bit weaker. Next, you can learn from your opponents. If you're playing in a game and your opponent beats you with a certain card that you thought was bad previously, evaluate whether or not that initial evaluation was correct, and learn from what your opponents are doing. It's a great way to learn about extra synergies, what types of things decks can do, or sometimes even sleeper decks that you hadn't previously considered. Finally, for some practice for yourself, I'm not going to be talking through the answers to these questions, but these are things for you to think about. And in the comment section down below, if you take the time to write out your answers to these questions, I will be responding to people who do that and give my thoughts on these. So, black-red aggro in Kaldheim. We're going to go through the steps. Cards, generic power. Are the black-red cards good in the set? Are the black and red strong or weak colors? Black and red, are they complementary colors? And is there any card that would get better in black-red that other decks would not necessarily be interested in? Next, on strategy. Is the strategy of black-red simple? Is the strategy of black-red proactive? Is it difficult to interact with what black-red is doing? Is it something you would do anyway in your black-red decks, trying to maximize the specific strategy? Next, support. Are there a lot of payoffs for what black-red is doing? Are there a number of enablers for what black-red is doing? Are those quality enablers? Are those quality payoffs? And does it align with what the format is about? Next, competition. Is there a lot of card overlap between the cards that black-red wants and the cards that other decks want? Is there an awareness of what black-red is actually doing in the format? Is there an ease of entrance into black-red? Can you get into a black-red deck, or do you have to rely on and wait for a specific card to come along? And finally, is black-red an easy deck to play? Is there an ease of execution associated with black-red? Traps. Are there weak payoffs for black-red? Is there a lack of support for the archetype that you think black-red is going to be in Kaldheim? Is it a bad format fit? And is the Signpost Uncommon leading us astray? Is black-red going to be different from a black-red aggro deck, as the Signpost Uncommon maybe tells us it would be? Anyway, with that practice in mind, thank you so much for watching the video. I really do hope you enjoyed it. Remember to hit that thumbs up button, subscribe to the channel, and comment if you have questions or feedback. Also, you can click that bell to get notified when I post future videos. And you can also support my channel content and my channel via the Patreon, patreon.com/NicolaiBolas. And all patrons are going to get access to my card-by-card grade spreadsheet for Kaldheim. So if you're looking to get ready for that set, when the full preview is out, you can, and you're a patron, you'll get access to my thoughts on all the cards. But yeah, that is going to do it for this video. If you made it all the way to the end, in the comment section down below, leave hashtag archetype review. Also leave your responses to that practice. I think it can be a great way for you to get some feedback on how you're evaluating archetypes. But yeah, that's going to do it for this video. I really do hope you enjoyed it, and I will talk to you next time.